What is up, A-Push people? This is Mr. Winchell, coming to you with the first in our series of A-Push content-specific review videos for the 2020 AP U.S. History exam. Today I'm going to talk you guys through just specifically periods 1 and 2, some of the key concepts, some of the need-to-knows, some of the big ideas to best prepare you for what lays ahead A-Push-wise. So first, I want to talk you through what College Board says you have to know, some of the broad developments, some of the broad categories of content for you guys to be aware of. I pulled these from the AP framework for this year. A couple things to emphasize. Key concept 1 really talks about what native populations look like pre-European contact, so pre-Columbian Exchange, pre-colonization, pre-exploitation. So what it is that these native societies are doing prior to the arrival of the Europeans in the 15, 16, 1700s. So that's key concept 1 that I'll be going over. Key concept 2 is what really happens when these two worlds collide. When you see what becomes known as the Atlantic system, this system of exchange, of culture, of disease, of ideas, of goods, of money, of resources between really the three main players in this conversation, which is Europe, the Native Americans, and Africans, and what the effects of these exchanges are on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. And then the following key concept goes more into the next step, which is European colonization. What does it look like in the specific colonies for the Spanish, for the French, for the Dutch, and then later for the British? What's their colonial system? What is it that they're doing there? Why are they doing it there? What is their system of control? What is their system of labor? So that's really the next key concept. And the final key concept is much more driven, or we'll spend the majority of our time today on the British colonies in particular. What are the British colonies doing in British North America? What is their system of colonization? What is their system of exchange? What is their system of control? And then how does that lead to a unique British unique development of British colonial character? So all that today is what we have to go through. I really broke it down into 4 things, this unit or units, because it's 2 today at a glance, which in a typical year would be about 10 to 15% of the test weight at the end of the year. We're really going to cover the years 1491. And we use that kind of as a placeholder for what the Americas look like before Columbus's discovery of the New World. 1491 all the way up to 1763, which is really the end of the French and Indian War and this end of colonial development absent of strict British control. So in this time period, we have 4 things to talk about, and I have it numbered on the slide so you guys can keep track. 1 is pre-European contact. What does the world look like before the Europeans show up? 2 really mirrors the next step on the key concepts from the College Board. What does European exploration look like? What does the Columbian Exchange do to the world? 3 is what does colonization look like from the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch perspectives? They're going to colonize different areas of the New World with a very different level of control, different focus, different goal, different influence in different parts of the New World. And the 4th piece, as I alluded to earlier, we're going to spend the most amount of time on, which is the development of the British North American colonies and what we now know as the eastern seaboard of the United States of America. So that's kind of the preview where we're going. Let's start with number 1. What do native societies look like before European conflict? Now, really, what we should know here is that what the natives do is unique to each tribe, is unique to each region, but we can attach a couple of broad generalizations that apply across the board to the native societies. Generalization 1 is that the native societies don't necessarily believe in this European vision of land ownership. They look at land as a human versus land relationship in a way that Europeans do not. And what that leads to is native societies in which native peoples are going to adapt what they are doing to the land around them, to the areas around them. So, for example, in the Great Plains here in what we now know as the Midwest, the middle of the country, not exactly suited for long-term farming. So the native societies are going to be much more so travelers, are going to follow the buffalo, follow, seasonally speaking, what it is they're doing. Whereas on the eastern woodlands here on the eastern coast, it's a little more suitable for long-term or long-scale farming. We're going to see native societies there adapting to their world around them and embracing that life. In the Southwest, we see the Native American societies there relying heavily on maize, on corn. On the West Coast, we see Native American societies adapting to kind of a hybrid economy of hunter-gatherers, fishing because of access to good fishing waters. But it's important that we understand that when we talk about Native Americans, it's not just one Native American society, but a vast network of Native American societies that often interact, often participate in exchanges, often participate in conflict with each other. But there's not one language, not one culture, not one type of vision on the world. And that's one of the things that keeps Native Americans from uniting to resist European expansion, European colonization, is the fact that despite the fact that, yes, they are in fact Native Americans, they are all very different in their culture and their language and their practices and their beliefs, etc. So this is kind of what now we know as North America looks like, tribe-wise, before European conflict. That's all, of course, going to change over time, with one of the main drivers of change being the Columbian Exchange. So post-Columbus, we see this huge push towards the New World by Portuguese traders, by Spanish traders, by Dutch traders, and then eventually afterwards by French, by British as well. So by 1650, we see the two main nations in control or influence in the New World being Portugal and Spain. We see the Portuguese influence really existing on the eastern coast of South America and what we now know as Brazil, whereas the Spanish influence, sphere of influence, is going to be more so on the western and northern parts of South America, as well as all of Central America and what we now know as Mexico and the southern United States, as well as Florida. So these two countries in particular are going to be the big drivers of the Columbian Exchange early on, as they're going to be gathering raw materials and resources like silk, like sugar, like gold, like molasses, like silver from the New World, and using their influence to try to gain a profit for the crowns of both of these countries. But it's not just those two. In the northern parts of the New World, we, of course, see Spanish control, where we've already talked about here in the Caribbean, here in Latin America. We see eventually British control on the Atlantic seaboard. We see French control through the northeastern parts of Canada. The Great Lakes region is heavily influenced by French exploration and trade, as well as the entire Mississippi River Valley right there through the middle of the United States. Is going to be influenced heavily by French exchange. Excuse me. We're going to see the Dutch being heavily involved in what we now know as New York. And then even the Russians get in the game a little bit here on the western coast of what we now know as Alaska, Canada, and the northwestern United States. Now, what this looks like exchange-wise, exchange is a two-way street. What this means to the New World comes a bunch of really important things. Cattle, horses, pigs, livestock that transforms the New World for Native Americans and colonizers. Plants like wheat, plants like rye, sugar and rice into the Caribbean and South America are all going to be things that are taken from the Old World, largely Asia and Southeastern Asia, excuse me, and moved to the New World. From the New World to the Old World goes maize, corn, potatoes. Tobacco becomes a big driver of Old to New World exchange. Beans, squash, peppers, cocoa beans, and syphilis. So we send syphilis from the New World to the Old World. But particular influence in the Columbian Exchange is disease. The two main diseases that go from the Old World to the New World are going to be malaria and yellow fever. It's going to be these two diseases, particularly malaria, that the Native American peoples have no previous exposure to, no previous experience with. That's going to be a huge driver in the decimation of Native American populations in the New World, here in South America. In the northern parts of America, the big disease that's going to be heavily decimating Native American populations is going to be smallpox. So what I would know if I were you guys is how the Columbian Exchange improves the standard of living in the old world as they get exposed to new goods, new resources, new crops that then vary their diets and make people healthier. But it's terrible for quality of life in the New World as disease is going to decimate the native populations of North America. Now, beginning with all this colonization and trade and exploitation is going to be a long transformation of the Americas from what they look like pre-European influence to post-European influence. Now, for the sake of the college, for APUSH, the Spanish play a huge role because they're going to have a long-term influence in what becomes North America. The Spanish are going to introduce a new caste system, which is going to lead to a very racially diverse population in the Spanish Empire. This caste system is going to categorize people based on their racial background, and then that's going to influence their social standing, their political standing, their economic standing. We're going to see the mestizo population, which are going to be people who are mixed between Spanish and native ancestry. A mulatto population, which is going to be those who are mixed between Spanish and African ancestry, as the Spanish are going to be bringing in a large number of African slaves. With, of course, those who are pure Spanish blood being at the top of this caste system. Now, the Spanish are going to introduce what's called the encomienda system in the 16th and into the 17th centuries as a system of labor. Now, what this looks like is the Spanish crown. The Spanish crown is going to grant or give away land to Spaniards in the New World. Now, in return, the Spanish are going to promise, as they come to the New World, to Christianize their natives, to take the native population in modern-day Mexico and Central America and the Caribbean and California, and take those natives and convert them to Christianity. Now, in return, the Spanish would gain tribute. They would spread the word of God, and in reality, it looks very little like this. As you guys know, we live in California. We have the mission system throughout California. Father Junipero Serra. But in these missions, we see the Christianization of native, but we also see the exploitation of natives for labor, the harsh treatment of natives, etc. So natives are impacted significantly by this Spanish influence. Many are treated incredibly harshly. Many are used for manual labor, building roads, building infrastructure, farm. Eventually, the encomienda system is overthrown by the Pueblo Revolt, and the Spanish use a slightly lighter hand in controlling the natives. And eventually, the system is replaced by African slave labor in the Spanish colonies as well. But it's important to understand what the Spanish are trying to do here, how they justify it by saying that they're here to Christianize natives, and then what that looks like in terms of native populations in these places. So one thing to emphasize is that we see Europeans and American Indians looking at the world very differently. We see both groups in society having very conflicting views on land ownership, on economies, on political power, on religion, and that's going to lead to some conflict for the next 250 years. Native Americans embrace a much more nature-based spiritual relationship between man and earth, in that Europeans are there to try to spread Christianity, that the whole world should be Christian, that Europeans, whether it be via Catholicism for the Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire, or Christianity through later the Puritans and the separatists from the British colonies, are going to be trying to spread Christianity to a people that don't look at formal religion the same way that Europeans do. Politically speaking, the Native Americans are tribal based, with simple tribal structures that vary based on the tribe that we're speaking of. There are some complex confederations or groups of tribes that we see in places like the Iroquois that have larger empires, but their political system is much more simple. Whereas Europeans are based on nation states, on countries that are working to expand their influence in Europe and overseas, that for the most part are governed by monarchies. But even in these European countries, we're starting to see these basic ideas of individual rights that are going to come about, as we'll talk about shortly, and things like the Enlightenment. Now, economically speaking, the Native Americans are much more communal, much more community-based, much more working for the greater good, for the common good, working to live in harmony with the land. Native Americans are not trying to work to create wealth from the land, but rather use the land to sustain life, to sustain stability of their tribal organizations. Whereas Europeans are going to show up to the New World expecting the idea of private ownership of property, of saying, this is my land, I'll put up a fence on it, and now I own it. Here, this is mine. And they're going to work then to use the land, which is one of the main resources that is attracting Europeans to the New World, is availability of land. Land plus labor, oftentimes will end up being African slaves, is going to increase or equal the increase in wealth for Europeans. So they're going to look at different ways of looking at the world, at looking at what the world is there to do, which is going to cause some conflict as well. Now, broadly speaking, the three main groups of colonizers we should know are the Spanish, the French, and we could put it French/Dutch because they take a very similar colonization pattern, and then the British. The Spanish are going to colonize what we now know as Mexico, Florida, the southwestern part of South America, and much of Latin America. The Spanish are going to use Native American labor. This is unique to the Spanish. And that the Spanish use and exploit Native American workers to do their labor. And they're going to treat the Native Americans very harshly. They're eventually going to need to replace Native American labor with African labor, as disease is going to cost many Native Americans their lives. And they're eventually going to focus on African slavery as well. But the Spanish are there in a way that is different from the French and the British, in that they are there to control and Christianize the Native Americans in a way the French and the British never intend or attempt to do. So that's Spanish colonization. Things to know is they are heavily influenced by the attempts to get gold. They are heavily influenced by Christianization of natives, and they exert much stricter control on the natives and on their colonies than any of the other European powers do. Now, the French are going to have the loosest amount of control on both the native side of things and their colonization side of things. They're going to have the fewest volume of settlers. New France is going to be that area of North America I just showed you in northwestern Canada through the Great Lakes region. It's very cold. It's very rocky. The French aren't going to send a lot of people to the New World. And for that and a couple other reasons, the French are going to have much more positive relations with the Native Americans than either of the other two countries do. The French are there, particularly speaking, almost exclusively for the fur trade. They are there to acquire beaver furs and ship those beaver furs for a profit back to France to be sold in Europe. And because of that, because they're not trying to own land or exploit labor, they're going to have much more positive relationships with the Native Americans. They're going to live amongst the Native Americans. They're going to respect Native American culture. We're going to see much more intermarriage between French explorers and colonizers than we will between British or Spanish empires, because they are there for much more positive relationships. They understand that both the natives and the French can have mutually beneficial relations between the two sides. That's the French. The Dutch are very similar, and it's like they're going to be more so in New York. But again, less control, less attempts to influence. The French and Dutch are very similar in that regard. Now, the British side of things, they're going to come a little later. Their colonies are going to be set up in Canada on the eastern seaboard, and then along the Atlantic seaboard of what we now know as the United States. Now, they're going to be built for a variety of reasons, and we'll talk about that shortly as well. But they're going to be built, some built for immediate profit and economic gain, others built to try to practice some semblance of religious freedom. But they're not going to be very strictly controlled by the British. Because unlike the Spanish, it's not necessarily the British government that is sending them there with a purpose. It's much more so groups of individuals or private business who are sending British colonizers. And because it's not the government who is pushing these people to go settle, colonize, and Christianize, they're going to exert less control. Unlike the Spanish, the British are not going to try, a very, very small scale, but short term. Long term are not going to try to use Native Americans for labor. And instead, their big emphasis is getting the Native Americans off the land so that the British settlers can create their own societies in the absence of Native Americans. Unlike the Spanish, we don't see a huge attempt to Christianize or convert Native Americans. Instead, the British settlers to the Americas just want that land and want the Native Americans out of their way. So because of this, because of numbers, it's England and Spain that are the two major powers in the Americas, because they have the most people that settle, because they have the largest geographic influence, and because of this, then economic influence that comes with it. So those are the 3.5, if you want to throw French and Dutch together, groups that are really important to understand colonization-wise. So moving particularly, because this is the heavier emphasis for the course, into the development of the British North American colonies, it's important that we understand kind of what the numbers look like. From England specifically, we're going to see in the early to mid-1600s about 200,000 British people leaving England for the New World. Now, over half of these people are going to settle on the small islands in the Caribbean that we now call the West Indies. They're going to settle there on sugar plantations, on other plantations on small islands, in an attempt to get rich off of a plantation-style economy. A small number will go to Bermuda. The next biggest chunk of people will go to the Chesapeake, the colonies that we now refer to as Maryland, much more so Virginia, and then upper North Carolina. And then about half of the people who go to the Chesapeake will go to New England to attempt to create a society built more on religion. So that's kind of what the numbers look like. The rest of the course is really, really focused and centered on this area here in what we now know as British North America. But it's important that you understand for the global context that it's not just British people coming to what we now call the United States, but rather a large number of people coming to the New World across the board. Now, what that's going to create is a significant amount of population that exudes some diversity ethnically, some diversity racially. We see a heavy British influence. Is the green here on the Atlantic seaboard, in New England, which is the Northeast, in the Chesapeake, which is here, and then in what becomes known as the Southern colonies, which are down here. We see by 1700, by 1750, a significant influence of African slaves that are in South Carolina along the Atlantic seaboard, that are largely being imported through Charleston, that are here in what was Jamestown along the James River in the Chesapeake. But we also see some other racial groups that are settling, and these other racial groups that are not British are going to be settling on the frontier, and that's going to play a bigger role later. We see German people settling on the frontier in Pennsylvania along the Susquehanna River, in New York as well. We see Irish people settling on the frontier along the Appalachian Mountains, and we see Scots-Irish people as well that are settling on the frontier. We still see as well a little bit of Dutch influence here in New York, along the Hudson River, because, of course, New York was at one point a Dutch colony before being taken over by the British. So this is going to lead to a diverse population that is unique to the British North American colonies compared to the rest of the world. A place in which it's much more of a melting pot of societies and cultures. Of course, they're all white, with the exception of African populations of white European cultures that are existing in the same space. So by the end of the 17th century, this is kind of what our geographic setting is going to look like. We're going to see the New England colonies, which are up here at the Northeast, NE, New England and Northeast. The colonies of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. We're going to see our middle colonies, what we now know as New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, sure. Not that they necessarily matter to this conversation, but they're there. And then the Chesapeake colonies, which are going to be Virginia, and Maryland. And then our lower south or our deep south colonies are going to be North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So what this means is that unlike necessarily in Spanish North America or French North America, in British North America, we're going to see a huge diversity, not just of ethnic populations, but also of economies and political systems and social systems. Because in all of these regions, we see the people coming to America for a different reason. And because they're coming to America for different reasons, they're establishing very different societies once they come to the New World. What I often tell my students is the line, why you go somewhere influences what you do when you get there. So in this case, like those that come to the New World to get rich are going to take actions that back up this motivation of getting rich. Those that come to establish a religious utopia are going to take steps once they arrive to establish in their mind a religious utopia. So it's important that we understand that because this is not directed by the British government, people are able to pursue what they want to pursue colonization-wise, and that's going to lead to a huge divergence in economies, in political systems, and in social systems across the British North American colonies. That's going to then play an impact on our development later as a country. So that's our regional map, which is important to identify. Now, I want to start in the south, and then I'm going to go to the north, and then I'll go back to the middle colonies afterwards. Now, the southern colonies, we can lump together the Chesapeake and the Deep South because eventually they're going to really merge into a very similar system. The southern colonies are going to be built on a plantation economy. They're going to be built on ownership of large amounts of land for agriculture that is not meant to sustain communities or people. This agriculture is instead meant to maximize profit. So in these plantation economies, the crops may differ. The Chesapeake is going to be heavily reliant on tobacco. The deeper south, South Carolina and the Georgia coast and the southern part of North Carolina are going to be heavily reliant on rice. We're going to see other areas heavily reliant on indigo and corn in inland South and North Carolina. But the plantation economy in general is important to note that it's one person or one family owning a large tract of land, normally using forced labor, whether it be indentured servitude or later African slaves, to labor on that land and then use that land to maximize profits. The southern colonies are going to be heavily reliant on slavery because of the plantation economy. The plantation economy is very demanding labor-wise, which is going to lead to the development of a unique slave-based system in the South. The southern colonies are very, very much more socially speaking built on an aristocratic social structure in which those that have all the land have all the power, have all the money, and then it's those that have all the land that are exerting this influence to create policies and a society that benefits their way of living. Southern colonies are going to be much more sparsely populated than the northern or middle colonies because of this plantation system, right? Because it's built on the more land you get, the more money you get. That means that less people are densely packed, so the population is much more spread out. It's also going to then lead significantly to the desire for expansion. As the plantation economy is built on more land, and more land means you need to expand as people come, and that's going to lead to then this expansion of the plantation system, plantation economy in the southern colonies. So it's important to note that because the southern colonies were first planted by those attempting to gain a profit, the systems they put in place afterwards back up that goal. And that's why we end up with a plantation-style economy and plantation-style social system in the southern colonies. So in the South still particularly, we start, of course, in Jamestown in 1607. These explorers or colonizers are attempting to get rich quick. They are part of a joint stock company that is expecting instant profits. So they come to find gold to get rich. It does not work that way. What ends up creating success for these colonists is tobacco. And once tobacco becomes a successful cash crop for the Jamestown colony, the next question becomes, how do we get more people to come? Because with more people come, that creates more stability, that creates more economic wealth, that creates more prosperity. And some of the ways in which we're going to attract people to come are going to then create systems that are going to cause social conflict down the road. The first is the headright system. The headright system is basically the statement that we will give you land for you and more land for every indentured servant you bring with you. What this means is that somebody who has some semblance of wealth can pay for themselves to come to the New World, pay for 8, 10, 12, 20 indentured servants to come with them to the New World, and they're going to be given a plot of land based on how many people that they bring with them. This is going to motivate people to then bring more labor, because more labor equals more land. Now, these indentured servants, the system of indentured servitude is simple. It's those maybe who have no options in the old world, maybe who've been convicted of small crimes in the old world, those who are incredibly poor in the old world. They will come to the New World. They will work for a set amount of time, 5 to 7 years normally. And once they live past those 5 to 7 years, they will be freed. They'll be given some land, and they can be their own small farmer in the New World. Now, the system of indentured servitude is great, right? It provides labor for the New World. It provides stability and population, which creates stability for the New World. A significant amount of indentured servants are actually in the first 30, 40, 50 years of the system are going to die before their term of service even expires. So society doesn't have to worry about giving them the land when they're free, because they're not going to get to be free because they're going to die anyway. But once these indentured servants start living out their term, as the Chesapeake becomes healthier and more stable, as resources become more plentiful, these indentured servants start living to the end of their terms, being freed, and then the only land that's left for them is way out on the frontier. Why is that the only land that's left? Because of the headright system. Because the system that brought them over is designed to give more land to those who can bring more people. So the plantation elites that were able to bring these settlers in the first place to the New World, they have all the good land, so to speak, in the more established parts of Virginia and Maryland. So that's going to lead the free indentured servants out to the frontier to kind of fend for themselves out in a much more undeveloped society. Now, of course, out on the frontier, we're going to see a much more conflict with Native Americans, who are being pushed and pushed and pushed away from mainstream society in Virginia. We're going to see these freed indentured servants who feel as if society has not held up their end of the bargain. Like, you promised me stability, you promised me land, and here I am out in the middle of nowhere trying to farm, trying to chop down trees and whatnot. And it's this that's going to lead in 1676 to Bacon's Rebellion. Now, Bacon's Rebellion is a very significant watershed or turning point moment in American society, as it is a multiracial, multi-gender rebellion that is less about race and more about class. It's these backcountry frontier settlers who are upset that they've come to the New World, they've put in their time as an indentured servant, they've been sent out to the frontier, and now the same society that helped bring them over refuses to protect them from Native Americans. These rebels, these small farmers, the yeomanry later, if you will, are going to be protesting that the government is not serving their needs. And the rebellion itself is going to be led by Nathaniel Bacon. Again, I said 1676, important turning point year for you to know. It's going to be significant because it is black and white individuals rebelling together, men and women rebelling together. And the rebellion itself is a demonstration of class conflict. It is the lower class rebelling against the upper class. And that's important. That's important. Now, what this does is this creates the colonial elites are going to pivot. This pivot had already been processing and beginning in 1619 from relying on indentured servants, as labor, and transitioning that to a much more African slave-based labor. A couple reasons. Reason one, slaves become cheaper and cheaper due to the availability of slaves. And as society gets healthier, these slaves they're having a lower mortality rate. They're living longer. So then therefore they become worth the investment. Now we can buy African slaves. They don't need to be freed after 5 to 7 years. They don't need to be given land after 5 to 7 years. They're not going to be allowed to then go out on the frontier and cause a rebellion, cause conflict for society, because they're going to be stuck in captivity forever. And then their children can also become slaves. And then this whole system is built up in a way that then encourages the transition from indentured servitude to African slaves in Virginia and below. So Bacon's Rebellion is important because it just speeds that process. It demonstrates that the indentured servant system might be creating more trouble than it's worth, and therefore it will be a better idea to rely on the permanent labor system of African slaves. So those are all different ways that are attempted to be used by the Chesapeake colonies to attract colonists. The head-right system offers land. That's attractive. Indentured servitude and slavery offer labor. That's attractive. What's also attractive is the idea of self-rule. Beginning in 1619, Virginia creates the House of Burgesses, which is the first colonial assembly in the New World for the British, it's a huge, important turning point moment, as it provides those in Virginia a way to govern themselves. So all of this, whether it be for political reasons or economic reasons or social reasons, are going to become attractive to those in the Old World wanting to come to the New World. We see, of course, this famous advertisement offering the most excellent fruits to plant in Virginia, as the New World is going to try very hard to attract as many people to come settle as possible. Now, beginning much before Bacon's Rebellion, but for British North America, sped up by Bacon's Rebellion, is this huge influx of the Atlantic slave trade. Now, we see largely from the western coast of Africa, places today like the Congo, like Sierra Leone, a huge amount of slaves being bought or kidnapped from Africa and transferred across the Atlantic Ocean in what's called the Middle Passage, and sent to the New World. Now, a vast majority of these slaves are going to be sent to two places combined: the West Indies and the sugar plantations, which are here, as well as Brazil, which is here. But post 1650 into the 1660s, 70s, and 80s, and then into the 1700s, a large amount of African slaves are also going to be sent to British North America, to the colonies like Virginia and later North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Now, the slave trade is going to build a pretty unique social structure, social system in these southern colonies. And I kind of alluded to this a little earlier. At the very bottom of this society are slaves. Now, post-Bacon's Rebellion, we're going to see the colonial elites really emphasizing race as the difference between people, as opposed to social class as the difference between people. They saw the danger in what happens when the lower classes unite across racial lines and try to overthrow the system because of Bacon's Rebellion. And because then this introduction of slaves is going to allow white society to put black society at the bottom, and therefore unite white society along racial lines instead of class lines. So the bottom of Southern society is going to see slaves as the foundation, as those doing the labor. Above them, socially speaking, are the indentured servants while they still exist. Those who come to do forced labor, usually alongside slaves, but those who have an end date to their term of service, and those largely who are white. Above them in society are those that are landless whites who can work labor and terms of service for other people, but aren't stuck in labor like indentured servants are. Above them are the small farmers, what we commonly refer to in period 3 and 4 later on as the yeomanry. This yeoman class who don't have large plantations, but they own a small plot of land. They're usually farming for sustenance, farming to survive. They own the land, they own their labor. And then above them is the tiny apexes of the society, the plantation owners who own the best land, who are profiting the most from the system. So that's really what Southern society looks like. College Board asks you to know how these regional differences develop and are influenced. And this social structure is an important thing to have in the back of your head, SFI wise. Now I'm going to jump all the way up to the northernmost colonies in New England, starting with Massachusetts and then Connecticut and Rhode Island. Now, unlike Virginia, in which the people that settled in Virginia and settled in the South are there for economic motives, those who come to New England are coming for religious motives. We see two main groups, the Puritans and the Separatists. Both have a problem with the existing structure of the Church of England and want to leave England and practice their own pure version of Protestantism, of Christianity. They're going to settle here along the Atlantic seaboard in Connecticut, in Plymouth Colony, in Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. This area is still called New England today. And we see beginning in the 1630s what's called the First Great Migration. As about 70,000 Puritans trying to purify the Church of England are going to leave England and come to America and settle in New England. This is largely driven by turmoil in England. We see the English Civil War and a bunch of religious persecution there is going to cause this many, 70,000 is a pretty significant chunk, are going to come to New England and settle here in these orange areas by the 1650s. We see in New England, I think this graph is quite helpful, quite telling. We see a huge increase in white settlement of New England. We see a very quick and steep decline of the Native American population in New England. And what's unique to New England is we still see very, 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 very little African American population in New England as well. New England is for the most part racially homogenous, and that it's almost all British Protestant white people. We don't see the heavy influence on slave labor. We don't see nearly as much indentured servitude and large-scale agriculture. And that's going to lead to a much more Protestant, pure type of society in the New England colonies. Now, as you can see, in England, the average life expectancy in the 17th century is about 53, 54 years old. In the Chesapeake, it's worse than that. Right? It's not even quite 50 years old, as the living conditions there are less healthy, are much more profit-driven. There's less community because everyone's more spread out, looking out for themselves. New England's unique in that people are living to be about 65 years old in the New England region for a variety of reasons. Reason one, this attempt to create community and togetherness. Reason two, this emphasis on the common good. And reason three, people are much more closely interconnected via the church. So people are looking out for each other, and then people are going to live longer. So New England, we're going to see very important influence of what's called the covenant theology. The covenant theology. This is going to really come about beginning with the Mayflower Compact, a very important document to have in the back of your heads, which is signed in 1620 as these settlers show up on the Mayflower. The Mayflower Compact is going to use the word we and us and together. We are going to operate for the common good. We are going to set aside what's best for the individual, what's best for the community as a whole. We are going to operate under God's law together, right? And this covenant theology is going to then heavily influence what New England as a society does. There's this argument this belief in this society in New England that those settlers have created a covenant or an agreement of grace between the communities themselves and God. And they've also created an agreement between each other in that they're going to all watch out for each other, but they're also going to watch each other to ensure that they are practicing the proper type of Christianity, mutual watchfulness. We're all going to look out for each other. We're all going to look at each other to make sure that we're all doing the right things. In New England society, we see very little toleration for disorder, for deviance, for getting out of line, for not following the practices, the teachings of God. And this covenant theology is going to play a pretty big role in the way these communities develop. Very little privacy in these communities as everybody's looking out for each other, but also looking at each other. And that's going to be best emphasized by a man who's very important early on in Massachusetts, a man named John Winthrop. He's the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He governs the Massachusetts Bay Colony for a long time. And he's who gives us our famous City on a Hill speech in the early 1600s. His argument is that, in his words, we shall be as a city upon a hill, the eyes of all people are upon us. And the general gist or the thesis of his statement is that we came here to practice religious purity. So we are going to practice religious purity so the whole world can look at us and say, look, there they are. They left the old world to practice religious purity, and there they are, being the perfect example of a God-fearing Christian society. His argument is that the colony should provide a beacon or a light for the rest of Europe, a model of Christian charity. And there's some good stuff in the City on a Hill speech, in that we all have to look out for each other. But the City on a Hill speech does reflect that covenant theology of we're all looking out for each other, but we're also all looking at each other. So Winthrop emphasized this common spiritual goal for the society as a whole, to create a city on a hill as a picture of righteousness for the rest of society. But with this city on a hill ideology, he sees some significant positives. New England experiences very unique demographic trends and social trends. Unlike the South, in which people are coming to get rich and in general poorer young men are coming, in New England, because it's much more based on religious society and togetherness, people are coming as a family. People are coming with their wife, with their kids, with their extended families as well. New England becomes then, therefore, a much healthier place to live. We see in New England the ideas of togetherness. Settlers are going to sacrifice what's best for themselves for the good of the community as a whole, which is going to make it unique in the colonial setting. Fun fact, average life expectancy is about 70 years of age, which especially for the time is exceptionally long. We see a bunch of extended families as people are bringing sisters and cousins and kids and wives to the New England. In New England, they're going to average about 6 kids per family, which is a lot of children for the time, as society is able to sustain a broader population. The average age of marriage, women are getting married about the age of 22, men are getting married at the age of 27. And as I like to point out in class, a fun thing to help remember New England is the New England colony really invented the idea of grandparents, of living long enough to play a role in your kids' lives. Because of this togetherness of families and communities and this longer life expectancy, the idea of grandparents we really see as given to the New England settlers. Now, not everybody was in line with this beautiful, pure religious experiment in New England. A couple groups to know that are seen as rebels or dissenters. The Quakers, who we usually associate with settling in Pennsylvania, which they do, are going to split off from the Puritan ideology over a couple things. One of the main reasons is compensation for Native Americans and the idea of acceptance of other faiths and other ideas. Because the Puritans come to New England to practice a pure form of their religion, we don't see this generally cited statement of they came for religious freedom. No, they came for freedom of their religion. The Quakers, on the other hand, believe much more so in toleration of ideas. So they're going to break off from the Puritan groupings, if you will. Anne Hutchinson is a very, very, very famous rebel, and she's going to argue for the idea of antinomianism, or that all people should be able to communicate with God directly, and that's going to cause her to be thrown out of the Massachusetts colony by John Winthrop. And Roger Williams, who is going to, among other things, be very critical of the Massachusetts Bay government's actions toward Native Americans and not compensating them for their land that they have been taking. It's going to cause him to be thrown out as well. And these people are going to, specifically Hutchinson and Williams, are going to be thrown out and go to Rhode Island, commonly referred to by those in Massachusetts as the sewer, because it's where all the trash from Massachusetts got sent to. But that's going to create a system of incredible religious toleration and freedom in Rhode Island that we don't really see anywhere else except for Pennsylvania, because the Quakers as well. So not everybody's in line. Not everybody's following the pure arguments of those like John Winthrop. But it's important to know that those who aren't getting in line are being sent out, which is one of the reasons why places like Massachusetts stays so pure, because it's easy to keep everybody together when everybody has the same ideas and the same beliefs. Now, the middle colonies are going to be kind of a combination of both regions: New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey. The middle colonies have excellent land for farming, whereas in New England they do not. Excellent land for farming and 3 very navigable rivers that allows for goods to be transferred in and out. The middle colonies are going to be much more much less aristocratic and much more diverse in its economic structure and its economic foundations. We're going to see fewer small industry than New England, but more than in the South. We're going to see much more diversity in the middle colonies. As ethnically speaking and economically speaking, there's much more mixture of stuff. We're going to see way more religious tolerance in the middle colonies than in New England or the South, specifically than New England. And much more urbanization in large cities in the middle colonies than we do in the South. The two main to know would be Philadelphia and New York City, which are the two biggest seaports for imports and exports in the British North American colonies. So what to know here is that unlike the South that's practicing plantation-style economies, plantation-style farming, the middle colonies are going to be much more so breadbasket-style farming. No, to my students, they're not farming bread baskets. What this means is they're farming the types of crops that you would use to feed people. So wheat, grain, corn, etc. Much more sustenance farming, not single cash crop style farming, but they're the farms that are going to feed the rest of the country later. So the things to know middle colony wise: breadbasket farming, diversity, and we see a much more mixed economy and mixed society than we do in the other two. So across the board, the colonies in general, about 80% of the colonists by the 1750s are farmers. It's a heavy agricultural society. Now, the style of farming is going to vary based on where people are, but it's still a society that's very built on people having their small plots of land or their large plots of land and farming it. It's one of the things that's so attractive to people in the old world to come to the new world is this ability to get land, own land, farm land, be economically self-sufficient, economically independent. By the 1750s, the American colonists are going to have a higher standard of living than that of Europe. Land is cheaper, wages are higher, people are healthier, people are more successful. So the colonies eventually are going to morph into a very successful, very healthy society. Now, across the board, for all three regions, the North, the Middle, and the South, they're going to be predominantly English with some diversity, largely on the frontier. These colonists are going to possess and enjoy British freedoms. They're going to be very proud of their British heritage, but these colonists are also going to have a significant amount of self-government, of the ability to govern themselves in the colonies, because for the most part, politically speaking, the British are going to let these colonists do whatever the heck they want to do. For the most part, in places like Pennsylvania, New York, and Maryland, we're going to see laws passed that are going to create religious toleration or these attempts to at least allow different styles of Christianity to be practiced, whether it be Catholicism or Protestantism or evangelism. We're going to see some educational opportunities in the colonies. Schools that become known today as Harvard and Princeton are going to be established very early to try to train colonists in education and train them in theology and in the Bible and how to spread religion. But there is going to be significant economic opportunity in the colonies that does not exist in the old world because of the availability of land, because of the availability of resources, because we don't see things in the colonies like we see in England, like the laws of primogeniture, which pass on entire estates only to the firstborn son. We see a much more ability to climb the social economic ladder in the New World than the old. And by the 1750s, the colonists have been developing separate from the British monarchy in a way that creates a unique colonial character, and that they're proud of their British heritage, but also they go about things in a way that is different from the British, and that's going to cause some conflict that we'll talk about in period 3. Now, one other similarity across the board to note, it's very helpful in SFI, is that in all regions, we see significant conflict with the natives. The ones to know, I have listed there for you. In the Chesapeake, we see the Powhatan Uprising, which is an attempt by the Powhatan Confederacy to overthrow and crush the rapidly spreading and expanding and growing Jamestown settlement. It like almost every native conflict that we're going to see for the rest of this course is going to be a short-term success for the natives, but a long-term loss. They're going to raid and invade some Virginia Chesapeake settlements, killing a bunch of people, but the response then by white society is going to be much more aggressive and brutal. Again, short-term win, long-term loss. In New England, the two to know are the Pequot Wars, which happened early in settlement in the 1630s, which is going to really destroy the Pequot tribe. The last attempt by New England Native Americans to resist British expansion is called King Philip's or Medicomet's War in the 1670s. And that's going to really be the end of Native resistance in New England as King Philip tries to unite a variety of Native American tribes to come together to resist white expansion. And when the New England settlers are able to defeat him and execute him, it really does lead to the end of Native resistance in New England. Now, these aren't the only three. They're just the three that are helpful to know, to have in your back pocket to use as evidence and argument. And this is one of the, if you were asked what are some of the similarities across colonial regions, one key similarity is that all regions experience significant conflict with Native Americans. Now, the last couple things to talk about is this idea of Anglicization and how that influences colonial character. Now, what this means is that even though the colonists are far from England, they are still absorbing a ton of English culture, English political experiences, English religious experiences. And this is all because of what's called the Atlantic system of exchanges. Now, the colonists are shipping a bunch of goods back to the old world, to England. They're buying a bunch of goods from England. They're importing a bunch of things. A bunch of people are coming from New England. And what this also then leads to is ideas being shared across the Atlantic Ocean as well. One of those ideas, one of those movements, one of those processes is called the First Great Awakening. Now, the First Great Awakening is really the first, what I call the first shared experience in the colonies. It's the first thing that the colonies go through that happens colonies-wide. It's the first mass social movement in America. Now, the big issue here is that those in religion feel that society's gotten too far from God, and we need to reawaken our relationship with God and do so in a way that is different from the traditional way of practicing religion. Now, the argument here is that religion has gotten stagnant, religion has gotten boring, religion has gotten flat and old, and we need to reawaken it with some excitement. The First Great Awakening is going to directly challenge the Calvinist idea of predestination, in that God already knows when you're born if you're going to heaven or hell. And instead is going to argue instead for more salvation-based theology, in that people can take actions themselves to save themselves. It allows for a little more personal ownership over the religious experience in a way that was not necessarily available before the First Great Awakening. Now, the First Great Awakening, what it's going to do, though, is it's really going to democratize religion. It's going to create a bunch of new denominations, new ways of practicing Christianity. And in doing so, it's going to give people choices. It's going to give people options. It's going to split denominations, which is then going to create churches that are much more competitive with each other for followers. Now, this may not sound that exciting now, but the idea of people being able to choose how it is they practice their religion is important because it gives people some more control over their day-to-day living experience. And as I often argue in class, when you give people a little bit of freedom, what they want next is almost always going to be more freedom. It's going to convert thousands of people. The colonies become much more heavily religious because of the First Great Awakening. It's going to allow churches and established religions to become much more younger and vibrant. It's going to create a new wave of missionary work, as we see the First Great Awakening causing the church to try to outreach Native American populations. In New England, we see praying towns, these settlements that are trying to spread Christianity to Native Americans short term. And because of the First Great Awakening, we see a bunch of colleges that are formed in the colonies to try to train the next generation of preachers. Most of the Ivy League schools are actually founded because of the First Great Awakening as an attempt to create a more religious society in the colonies. Now, the other example of Anglicization and colonial character, of transatlantic exchange of ideas, is the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment is this era in Europe in the 17th, 18th century of intellectual ferment, it's a movement of logic, a movement of thought, a movement of science and reason. It's this movement of using the human mind and science and thought to solve our problems instead of relying on politics and religion to solve our problems. It's a heavily investing in moral philosophy over theology, in using critical thinking and thought to find solutions to everyday problems and moral problems and intellectual problems instead of relying on what the Bible says to solve our problems. Now, what this does is it really begins questioning the ideas of divine right. The ideas that the king or queen is in power because God put them there, and then to question their authority would be to question God. That's going to lead to some significant steps down the road. We'll talk about more in our Period 3 video. A couple names to know for who is involved in the American version of the Enlightenment. Ben Franklin plays a huge role in the scientific side of things, in working to harness the power of electricity and to harness the power of flight. He also plays a big role in the political development of questioning authority as well. Thomas Jefferson is going to owe a lot of his ideas that we'll talk about next unit to the political developments of the Enlightenment. And even Benjamin Rush is a helpful name to know as really America's first Enlightenment-trained doctor in working to find medical solutions to problems based on science and reason instead of politics and religion. So Enlightenment, again, is going to come from Europe, just like the First Great Awakening comes from Europe, and lead to the democratization of thought, the democratization of religion, the democratization of society, and giving people more options in the way they think and the way they worship and the way they pursue education. Across the board, this experience of democratization. The names to know for Enlightenment, of course, Locke, John Locke, and the ideas of natural rights, life, liberty, property, and that we are all entitled to those rights just because we are human, and the government's job should be to protect those rights. And when the government doesn't protect our right to life, our right to freedom, our right to pursue property, then it's our duty as citizens in a society to overthrow that government. We see Baron de Montesquieu, who argues that we should separate powers across branches of government so that no one person or no one entity could have too much influence. His argument is that power corrupts, so therefore we should split the power. Voltaire gives us the ideas of religious freedom, that we should separate church and state, that it's not healthy for society to have the reliance on one entity for your political expression and your religious expression. And that is also going to give rise to the idea of freedom of thought and expression and the freedom to question authority when appropriate. All of these ideas come out of the Enlightenment and are incredibly influential in the development of the British North American colonies. So all told, as we come to an end of this time period, we see this rise of the Atlantic exchange of goods, which is going to, we'll refer to it later, and even now as mercantilism, as the colonies themselves are going to be importing manufactured goods in large numbers from Great Britain and sending back in exchange raw materials, tobacco, indigo, flour, lumber. We see each region of the British North American colonies creating its own unique economy, but all three regions are going to participate in this system of mercantilism, in producing raw materials, sending them to the mother country, and buying back manufactured goods. We see smaller levels of exchange between the North American colonies and Africa, largely on a slaves for rum type of exchange. But we also see a significant amount of exchange taking place between the British North American colonies here in what's now the United States and the West Indies and the Caribbean. So with all of these exchanges, it's important to note that it's not just goods that are going back and forth, but it's also people, it's also ideas. And that's one of the things that it's going to give rise to the American Revolution, is all these ideas that have spread across the Atlantic via the Atlantic system of exchanges. This is often called the triangle trade. I think calling it the triangle trade is too superficial because it's more than just trade that is taking place, but it's also the exchange of goods and ideas and people. So as we wrap up period 2, a couple questions. Question 1, was colonial America democratic? And in some ways, the answer there is yes. New England, in particular, has colonial assemblies in each town in which every church member male can participate. That's a pretty democratic system given the rest of the world in the 17th and 18th centuries. Throughout much of the colonies, we see universal male suffrage in that you're not necessarily needing to be a property owner to vote. That's pretty democratic. However, political participation is limited and political power is limited to usually white males. So that's not a very democratic system. By the mid to late 1700s, we see the emergence of a new political elite in the colonies, which is going to, in some ways, resemble what's happening in England. And there's not a lot of ways to express political participation outside of each colony's local assembly. So that limits a little bit of what we see as democracy. We also see a bunch of tension and conflict that's worth noting. We see some class conflict, and we also see some race conflict that are just good things to have in your back pocket as a file. As I already talked about Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia in 1676. We also see a variety of other conflicts that are almost always about the urban elites versus the rural, backcountry, frontier, lower classes. Leisler's Rebellion in New York reflects that. We see the tenant riots across the board in the 1740s, 50s, and 60s in New York, New Jersey, and Vermont, which are tenant farmers who are rebelling against those giant landowners who are exerting too much control. The Paxton Boys and the regulators in both Pennsylvania and Carolinas are, again, reflections of frontier problems and this feeling that mainstream society mainstream government in the urban areas is not reflecting their best interests. Those are all examples of class conflicts. The most important ones to know are Bacon's Rebellion and the Paxton Boys, which we've referenced before in class. And then we also see the resistance by slaves to the new system of labor post Bacon's Rebellion. The Stono Rebellion is very much worth noting in the late 1730s in South Carolina. As slaves rebel, again, they're going to follow a pattern oftentimes like the Native Americans. Short-term, successful. They're going to exert some power over their white captors. Long-term, not so successful. As every slave rebellion, Stono being no exception, is going to create a pattern of rebellion and then increased control by white society, which is going to then create elaborate slave codes that's going to limit slaves' ability to learn to read, to learn to write, to gather in large groups. They're going to lose some of the freedoms that were given to them. And then even in New York City, there's this conspiracy that there's going to be a slave rebellion. And New York responds by hanging a bunch of slaves to send a message that you should not be rebelling here. So tension and conflict is worth noting as an underlying theme of period 2. Another important theme is population growth. The British North American colonies are going to grow incredibly quickly because they are successful, because they are profitable, and because they are, in general, quite healthy. Population doubles about every 25 years, which is very, very rapid population growth. In 1700, there's 250,000 people in the colonies. By 1775, it's 2.5 million people in the colonies. So it's a huge population growth throughout the 1700s, leading up to period 3, which we'll cover next. By 1775, 20% of those in the colonies are African. And of those 500,000 African or African Americans who are in the colonies, about 450,000 of which are slave. Why the population growth grows so rapidly? There's twofold. One, the reproduction rate. People are having more children in the colonies, specifically in New England and some of the middle colonies. The second reason, of course, is immigration, as a lot of people are leaving Europe for the opportunities that are provided in the New World. Economically speaking, the colonists are going to participate in that system of mercantilism in which their job is to produce raw materials, and their raw materials should be shipped back to their mother country. In this case, the mother country is Great Britain. Mercantilism is enforced via the Navigation Act, which is very important SFI to know. But the idea is that they exist to create profit for the mother country, and therefore they should only ship their goods to England only on British ships, which is going to lead to some economic restrictions on what the colonists can do. In New England, the economy is going to be built on small farms, logging, lumber, shipbuilding, fishing, and trade. They're going to tailor their economy to the resources that are around them and the type of community they want to build. In the middle colonies, we talked, of course, about the breadbasket ideology of wheat, corn, and family farms. We begin to see the small examples of early manufacturing in some of these middle colony cities like Philadelphia and New York City. So a hybrid economy in the middle. I told you it's a diverse culture. It's also a diverse economy in that Pennsylvania out on the frontier is going to be much more so breadbasket based, but Philadelphia, the biggest city in Pennsylvania, is going to be much more manufacturing, commerce, and trade based. And then in the southern colonies, of course, as we talked about large plantations and cash crops. Most transportation is going to take place over a seaport to seaport to seaport, as the colonies are not going to be very interconnected at all via any overland trails because of restrictions on technology. And there's really no need to connect each other via roads because they can use the ocean. And that's going to then create the system by the 1750s in which each colony kind of operates in its own little world, right? South Carolina operates doing South Carolina things. Massachusetts operates doing Massachusetts things. And these colonies are going to have a much closer connection across the ocean with the British than they are with each other. Now, that's all going to stop after 1750, but we'll save that for our next conversation. I hope this was helpful. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you all soon.